I'd like to talk about a matter that hasn't really, I think, got enough airing, and it did happen in March, towards the end of March, but be that as it may. And no one better talk about it than my guest, Advocate Mark Oppenheimer, because he was involved. And the matter concerns the ConCourt's refusal to give AfriForum leave to appeal in the matter. And one of the things, Mark, that the ConCourt noted was that the sorry, just bear with me. I seem to have lost my reminder note. One of the things that the ConCourt noted was that it was unlikely that this court would come to a different conclusion or different decision to the courts that have come before it. Now that strikes me as rather extraordinary on the part of the ConCourt, and I'm not aware of it elaborating on why it reached that decision. Just your comment generally on that decision, and then to have a look back at the Equality Court and the Supreme Court of Appeal decisions that preceded it.
Sure. So I think a lot of people were quite startled by the Constitutional Court's refusal to hear the matter. What they did on leave to appeal was say that there are no reasonable prospects of success, which means that the decision of the Supreme Court of Appeal stands. Why I think people were unsettled by this is that the court has dealt with other high-profile hate speech cases, and in those cases found hate speech. So in the case of Masuku, where there was anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist speech, the court found hate speech. And in the case of Golani, where there were allegations of homophobic speech, the court found hate speech. So it seems that when it comes to Afrikaners being targeted, that the rules are different. And I think that's alarming if we're meant to live in a non-racial democracy where all are equal before the law. In terms of how these sort of cases proceeded, so I ran the case for AfriForum in the Equality Court, which sits inside the High Court, and we ran it as a trial. And part of running it as a trial means leading oral evidence, and we spent a lot of time talking about the context of the speech. So the view is that these things shouldn't be understood in a vacuum, that you need to understand an underlying context, but that there's no requirement that you need to show a causal link between the words that are uttered and real violence in the world. So what we did do was lead testimony of people who had survived farm attacks, often in quite brutal ways. And then we also led testimony of people who had counseled these communities. So you're kind of getting a broader view, and then ultimately a very big bird's eye view. So evidence from Aris Roots, who'd written the book Kill the Boer, goes into detail about the nature of the killings, how often they involve torture and a strong sort of racial element. Examples of Kill the Boer being written in blood over people's dead bodies after they've been tortured to death. And then looking at the stats as well. So getting a sense of how prevalent these attacks are. So one way to try and understand that is to look at the general murder rate in South Africa, which is about 33 out of 100,000. But recognizing that out of that 33, actually only about 5 relate to intruder attacks. So a lot of murders in South Africa happen through social fabric crimes, drunken bar fights, or domestic violence. Farm murders are by definition intruder attacks. Now, the farmer murder rate is about 32,000 commercial farmers in South Africa. That rate is about 100 out of 100,000. So it's 20 times higher than the intruder murder attack rate. So that's an astonishing thing. And part of AfriForum's campaign around this is to say, well, it's a serious crime that requires some level of prioritization, like we've done with copper cable theft or with rhino poaching. And so that was, sort of what they wanted to raise awareness about. And then, of course, the song "Kill the Boer," exacerbates this environment. Its ordinary meaning is quite clear, which is that Afrikaners are deserving of being killed, and that people should go out and they should kill them. When I asked Mr. Malema in cross-examination what a farmer refers to, he said, when I think of a farmer, I think of a white person. So he made it quite clear that this was a racialized attack on white farmers. The High Court ultimately found that the meaning of the words "kill the Boer" referred to the ANC government and their failures in land reform. Now, this case wasn't argued by the ANC. When a poll was done recently to find out what most Africans thought the meaning of the words were, that was included in the poll, and it came dead last. So it seemed to be like an astonishing finding of the Equality Court.
Sorry, Mark, just to ask with regard to that, with the first court, with the first court, and what was essentially what in the law was what decision did the judge reach with regard to? You've talked about hate speech, but what are the elements that he should have decided upon to determine that it was hate speech and it should be done away with? And in this respect, I'm really looking at the idea that it's not the subjective intention of the speaker that's at issue. It's an objective test, and that. But essentially, one seems to understand that it's the issue is not what Julius Malema intended, but the effect that it is likely to have objectively ascertained. Could you just sort of pick up on that a bit?
Sure, just a technical thing. I can hear a bit of bleed through when I'm speaking, so maybe you should just mute your mic.
Okay.
So when you're trying to interpret what the words mean, what our prior courts have said is that it's not a matter for the speaker. So it's not about what they intend. It's not a matter of what an expert thinks the words mean. Experts' only role is to provide context for the speech. And really, it's a matter of, would a reasonable person understand the words to demonstrate an intention to propagate hatred against a racial or ethnic group or other groups, and incite harm against them, or that the words themselves are harmful. That's what our law requires. So one of the errors in the judgment was that the judge defers to what some of what Mr. Malema testifies. Now, Mr. Malema spoke out of both sides of his mouth in the testimony. So sometimes the sort of idea is, no, these words shouldn't be taken literally. It's just a sort of chant. And at other times, he makes it quite clear exactly what he's referring to. So when I'd asked him whether he would pledge never to call for the slaughter of white people, he refused to make that pledge. He said that violence is necessary in a revolution, that decolonization necessarily requires violence, that we are in a revolution at the moment, that when the time is right, they will bomb Union buildings, that he's not afraid of killing, he's not afraid of dying. All of this out of the speaker's mouth tells you that this is not just a song, that this is part of an ideological movement which is calling for white people to be killed. And, you know, he said that they would change the constitution to allow for whites to be driven into the ocean, for example. So very selective in terms of understanding what Mr. Malema's intent was. But as I say, it's not relevant what his intent was. It's a matter of an objective reading. Now, the Kill the Boer case had a sort of prior history in that Dibulu Ibunu came before the Equality Court in 2011. Dibulu Ibunu and Kill the Boer have similar meanings. There's an argument that there was some sort of like struggle heritage to Dibulu Ibunu in a way that Kill the Boer is often referred to as a struggle song, but not really. It seems to be one of those things that was sung really in the dying days of apartheid by Peter Makaba, and then heavily resuscitated by Malema. And there was an argument that Bunu refers to like the apartheid regime and doesn't refer to like Afrikaners, things like that. But even then, Colin Lamont said, I don't buy it. He said, even if it's got two meanings, you must look at both meanings. You must ask if both meanings are reasonable. And if it is reasonable for an affected group to believe that they are the target of the hate speech, well, then that plays a role in determining the meaning. So he declared Dibulu Ibunu hate speech. The matter then was brought on appeal before the Supreme Court of Appeal, and ultimately the parties agreed to settle it. At the time, Malema had been seeing Dibulu as a member of the ANC Youth League. He was then ejected from the party, and there was an agreement made that the ANC would no longer sing the song, and that they would counsel their members, not to engage in these kinds of practices. And it's quite clear that this was breached by Mr. Malema by continuing to sing Kill the Boer. There was a time when the EFF said we would never sing Kill the Boer, we only sing Kiss the Boer, something which Lamont had identified in his original judgment and said it's pretty obvious that kiss means kill. It's just a sort of way of loosely getting out of it. But they did persist in this defense for a little bit during the trial, until about the second day when we were trying to exit court, and we were met by a mob of EFF protesters who then sang shoot to kill the farmer, kill the Boer at us. And we filmed them doing it, and we brought it up in court to say, look, we can't run proceedings in a fair way if you're going to be harassing the legal representatives. And also, that's what they're actually singing. And so they then sort of changed their tune and said, well, of course, saying Kill the Boer is perfectly fine. So not really a bunch of people to be trusted. This case, Kill the Boer, then went on appeal to the Supreme Court of Appeal. And that court sort of did an interesting dance in some ways. So the High Court, the Equality Court, had dismissed all of the expert evidence that had been led by AfriForum on the basis that it couldn't prove that there was a causal link between the song and actual violence, despite the fact that the Constitutional Court had said you don't need such a link in the Kolani case. So the Supreme Court of Appeal just sort of ignored that question, really, said we're not going to entertain it, but recognized that no causal link is required, and then did a sort of fudge on what the words mean. So it's sort of a strange judgment. It was also marred by a recusal application brought against Judge Keatley. So in a prior matter, Judge Keatley had an AfriForum before in a case and had said something along the lines of, if I disapprove of the work that you do, and if you ever draw me as a judge again, I strongly suggest that you ask for my recusal. It was then found out the day after the hearing in the Supreme Court of Appeal that she had said this, and so a recusal application was brought, and she elected not to recuse herself. So, as I say, this sort of, in some senses, casts a black mark on the proceedings. The views on recusal are that if there's a reasonable belief that a judge is biased, so even if they're not actually biased, that is a reason to recuse, and this seemed to be one of those cases. And then the matter sort of stalled for just under a year. It sat on the Concourse desk until eventually they decided not to hear it. And the timing on that sort of seemed odd, partly because Julius had just sung it on Human Rights Day, and clearly the issue with South Africa and its international relations was heating up, and has now reached that crescendo by the song being played in the Oval Office before President Trump and before Ramaphosa. So there is a sense in which this was the art of the losing case, that because the matter escalated and because everybody felt this is a completely unjust outcome, that it then percolated up into the international arena. And, the Americans, as outsiders, and the Americans really care about free speech, look at this and they go, this is outrageous. How can a politician of this stature be singing this in stadiums full of 90,000 people? Trump says, why isn't this person being arrested? And we know without a doubt that if a different group was being targeted, they'd be lying in a prison cell. And, Trump makes the same sort of observation.
Mark, before we go on to the probably the most watched interview with, I was going to say the most watched interview with Cyril Ramaphosa, but he never does interviews at home, so it's probably the only watched interview with Cyril that involved Cyril Ramaphosa. But before we get on to that, looking at the going back to the Concourt's decision, and you've given a number of reasons why I would suggest the Supreme Court of Appeal's decision, there's plenty in it for the Concourt to have considered or considered in a different, taken a different view on it. I just wanted to ask you about the one thing that came out of the Supreme Court of Appeals case, and that was the reference to a reasonably well-informed person would take the utterances and the what Malema has been saying pretty much ad nauseum as simply as a historic struggle song and not as something more sinister. Now, I'm certainly aware back from my days in the legal fraternity way back when that the test for objectivity was first the reasonable man and then the reasonable person. But the insertion of well-informed suggests something else entirely, and certainly something more narrow than the standard objective test of the views of a reasonable person.
Yes, I agree. It sort of seems to change the rules. It's also not obvious to me that a well-informed person would merely view it as a struggle song. As I say, it doesn't really have a struggle pedigree. And also, you've got to look at where it was being sung. There's an article written by Ben Winks. He looks at sort of the different examples of where the song was sung. And one of them was at Senegal. And at Senegal, you had a young farmer, Brendan Horner, who'd been very brutally murdered. Sorry, I'm just going to ask you to mute your mic again. I'll get the feedback. So Brendan Horner had been very brutally murdered, and the people accused of killing him were on trial, and the local community had sort of come outside of the courts to protest farm murders, and the EFF had arrived, and they sang quite clearly, "Kill the Boer." And this is at a time of mass grieving, and so Ben Winks said this is quite an obvious case of hate speech, given that you're targeting a group in a case of vulnerability, and under circumstances when a farmer had been killed. There's an argument that we ought not to have blasphemy rules in South Africa, that it's not the mere utterance of a phrase that's banned. I don't think we apply that rule when it comes to racial slurs very well. I think it's quite clear to my mind that using certain terms is going to make a big difference where you say them. But you see a lot of examples of people who teach To Kill a Mockingbird, for example, being fired for mere utterance of words, mentioning them as opposed to using them at someone. But if we accept that you ought not to have a blasphemy law, then you must look at the context of the words, which I think is what our law requires. Then there may be cases where you could accept Kill the Boer being said. One would be in an interview like this. We're mentioning the phrase, we're not using it to incite harm. You could imagine that if you had a sort of a lecture on struggle songs and you mentioned the songs, and this is one of the songs that you mentioned, that would also be permissible. But when you're in the rally in front of 90,000 people, and you're not just saying the song on its own, you're first of all talking about why white people are land thieves, and why we must take their property, and that they are criminals and they must be treated as such. All of that stuff seems to be about like rallying up a crowd and getting them to do something about their problem, like slitting the throats of whiteness, that sort of stuff. I think it's a sort of travesty that the words weren't declared as hate speech. It seems to demonstrate a double standard in our law, and it's obviously viewed as quite clear acts of hate speech by people outside of the country, including the American government.
Well, perhaps let's look at the American government. I mean, this is quite a piece of theatre that President Trump indulged in. It's got notes, copies of reports of the deaths of farmers there, and he sort of eventually presses the president into Ramaphosa's hands, and then he screens what appears to have been a montage of exactly that. I think it was FNB Stadium rally to celebrate their 10th birthday, where Malema really goes off on a rant, and he's clearly going for the theatre. The theatre is huge, and the impact is actually chilling, even seen at that obscure angle of one's own television set. The problem is, and I think the biggest problem for Cyril Ramaphosa was that although what Malema has mostly upped the ante on since he left the ANC and created the EFF, that's in the context in which this has been chanted and sung. But the ANC has not done the one thing that could have, I think, made a huge difference, would not have required going to court over, and would have just let the song die its death, which, according to that survey you talked about, is where it appears to be going, where people recognize it for what it is and say it shouldn't be sung, was the fact that the ANC's never called it out. It's never called it out. He clearly hadn't seen the footage of the protest by the farmers with the crosses alongside of the road, which was quite an emotional thing to watch when it first came out. Now, I think more than reasonable, well-informed people, but just reasonable people will have seen a lot of that footage, and if not seen it, they would have heard about it. And it appears that our president did not, and he didn't because, frankly, I don't think the ANC has cared until now that the great losing case has hit the overseas spotlight. Now, that failure to speak out, the failure for the leadership of the country, of what was until last year the majority party of the country, to speak out against it. And surely that could have made a huge amount of difference to whether the EFF and Julius Malema performed it again, because their opposition, being the government, had disapproved, but it never did.
Well, on a political level, there's been an interesting game that sort of happened, which is that, with the formation of the GNU and the sort of collapse of support in the ANC, the one thing that the ANC have sort of relied on is this threat of, making a deal with the EFF and with MK. And so, the DA had to say, well, that would be a doomsday. And so we'll join the GNU and keep these guys out. But whenever there's a sort of disagreement, like over VAT or something else, you'll have calls within the ANC to say, well, these people in the DA, they can pack their bags and we can find other coalition partners, in reference to the ANC and the EFF. And there are many occasions where ANC officials have said, Mr. Malema's true home is in the ANC, and it's been said by Ramaphosa and by other leaders in the party. And so the one thing that sort of comes out of this meeting, which I think is hopefully a good opportunity, is that John Steenhuisen says, we are opposed to these lunatics, and we have fought very hard to keep them out of the government of national unity. And Ramaphosa sort of says, I will have no truck with them now. Now, of course, it's a very late realization to say it, but I think it's important that the FF and MK are viewed as an undesirable organization that no party will ever enter into coalition with. Similarly, the way that Alternative for Deutschland is dealt with in Germany, no one will enter into coalitions with them. And once they are now seen as untouchable and unengageable with, that strengthens the arm of the sort of more reasonable voices, and it make it easier, much easier for the DA to kind of deal with some of the terrible policy issues that the ANC have been sort of trumpeting and trying to co-opt the DA into. And so I hope that this strengthens their arm. I mean, the things that the Trump regime sort of identify as being serious problems, like expropriation without compensation, like farm murders, like race-based laws, those are all things that the DA has sort of talked about over the years. And there's, I think, a worry that they're, becoming complicit with the ANC and, wanting to sort of keep their nice ministerial posts. And I think they hopefully will take this as a signal that they need to push much harder, that they've got much more leverage over the ANC than they had before. One also hopes that during these negotiations that some of the concessions that the Americans want are made, because they're important. Especially one of the things that Ramaphosa identifies, and I think there's something true to this, one of the reasons why we have high levels of crime in South Africa is because we have high levels of unemployment. And the reason why we have high levels of unemployment is because the ANC have instituted like absolutely terrible economic policies for 3 decades. So unraveling some of that stuff would make quite a difference. Making changes to our labor law, removing BEE, allowing fair competition. I mean, think about something like Starlink. The fact that we've kept this from South Africa for so long, for you and I, it has no effect. We have access to the internet, it's fast, we'll pay the money, it's fine. If you're poor and black and you live in a rural area, you don't. So Starlink is like an absolute game changer for you. And the link between internet access and economic prosperity is just a direct line. And so, by trying to stop Elon from operating a business because he's white and he's not willing to give up 30% shareholding, you end up depriving, very poor, vulnerable black people of huge economic opportunities. So one hopes that there'll be a reversal on that and all the other, sort of examples of this sort of madness that's gone on for the last 3 decades.
Well, I saw prior to the meeting that Ramaphosa had worked out a sort of avoidance measure for Elon Musk and for Starlink. But of course, if any such thing was offered or discussed, if it comes out, we'll go. The business community, large and small in this country, will go mad over it, because the conversation is already turning against the idea of this sort of BEE requirement. And the problem for, as I see it, for Cyril Ramaphosa at this press conference was that these things essentially were alluded to. They could have been discussed more. I would have liked to see less about Kill the Boer and more about the other thing. The other thing I thought was rather interesting, and this relates not at all, but I've got you, so I'm going to ask or get your comment, is the fact that on what appears to be one of the administration's big no-nos about what South Africa has done was the South Africa's case at the International Court of Justice against Israel. And all Trump said was, well, essentially nothing. They must do what they must do. That's quite intriguing. Do you have any particular take on that response from Trump? Because I suspect there might be very much more coming on that issue in the near term.
I would think so. That executive order makes it quite clear that South Africa is being sort of singled out because of its case at the ICJ. The executive order talks about, bringing a genocide case against Israel instead of Hamas, who actually committed the genocide. Interestingly enough, there's sort of a statement that was made to the New York Times by Ramaphosa's spokesperson, where they said they intend on conveying to Trump that it's ridiculous to talk about genocide in South Africa, given that the Israelis are committing a genocide which the South Africans are bravely bringing them to task for. And I thought, what an absolutely insane thing to try and say, even just from a realpolitik level. It's quite clear that Israel is, America's greatest ally in the Middle East. That South African sort of move against Israel is contrary to America's interests. And so making moves like that is sort of spitting in the face of, one of our biggest trading partners, and so a seriously bad idea. I imagine that conversation will be had behind closed doors. There are obviously other concerns about South Africa's relationship with Hamas and Iran. This is sort of playing out in other areas. So, for example, I'm a council member of the University of Cape Town. And I'm not going to speak on the council's behalf, but I'll give you some sort of insights into what's on the public record there, which is that UCT is the biggest recipient of National Institute of Health funding outside of America. And UCT has been informed that their anti-Israel boycotts may very well lead to a loss in that funding. Which would have a devastating impact on the university, on its rankings, on the number of staff that it has, and the kind of research that it's able to do. So it's quite clear that Americans are very unhappy with South Africa and its institutions for its anti-Israel stance. On the merit of the ICJ case, you've had various sort of interim rounds. I did quite a lot of commentary on them at the time. I think I was one of the only South African lawyers not to cheer for Team South Africa, like we were sort of involved in the Rugby World Cup again, and you'd have just crazy amounts of misreporting on it. So every round there'd be South Africa wins genocide case against Israel, when in fact no such thing had ever occurred. If you read the judgments and you read the sort of not just the majority judgment but the minorities, it was quite clear that all that South Africa got in the interim case was to say, well, it's plausible that the Palestinians have a right not to have a genocide committed against them, as opposed to it's plausible that there's a genocide going on. And so, it was allowed for the case to occur. And then all of the judgments sort of said, well, the Israelis are not allowed to commit a genocide. Well, yes, obviously no one's allowed to commit a genocide, but you sort of would have proclamations that a ceasefire had been granted by the court when no such thing had been granted. We shall see what occurs in the matter and its finality. We know that documents have been filed by South Africa, and that Israel was given a 6-month extension on the basis that the South Africans had hidden certain information from the Israelis, and so the court wouldn't countenance that. But I think it's highly unlikely that South Africa will be successful in that matter. And I would think that the South Africans, if they want to sort of keep up a good relationship with America, should withdraw their case, which they're entitled to do in terms of Article 89 of the ICJ rules, as has another country which had joined the case.
Well, I think that it's interesting because the overall impression from both from the Kill the Boer performance last night, if I can call it that, and the ICJ case, is that the South Africa, the ANC in particular, does not appear to be either gifted enough or worked hard enough to anticipate dealing with these highly negative issues on the world stage, and I think that's come through repeatedly. I mean, as I think it's been said a number of times, is that you wouldn't have to, the ANC wouldn't have to give up its support of the Palestinians, but it could, for example, call for Hamas to release all the hostages, because hostage taking is in wartime is a war crime. So it seems like our lack of preparation, our lack of experience, notwithstanding the fact that ANC was at the head of government for 30 years, it's starting to show. Can I just make a little observation before I let you go? And that is that since the whole issue of kill the Boer, kill the farmer, farm killings, and then considering Afrikaners as a sort of at-risk minority and allowing people to come in as refugees, which creates its own issues. There's clearly information about the complexities of the South African situation that the Americans either don't follow or don't care one way or the other. But one got the impression with seeing that sort of two golfing greats, and given how much golf means to the president, that perhaps that's where he gets his information, and that the sort of nuances and the depth that needs to be gone into don't come through. That he has an emotional connection with Retificus and anything else, and maybe much of his decision making is based on that emotional connection rather than the facts, the deeper issues.
I'm not so sure. So I think that he has access to a panoply of intelligence communities in America. The President of the United States, you can find out exactly what's happening in South Africa in immense detail. He had printed out a number of news reports about farmers being tortured and killed, which he handed to Ramaphosa. I'm sure that that evidence is bolstered by the personal relationships that he has, and it was telling that Gerson talks about growing up on a farm, and how there are moves to try and burn his farm down, and how his father's farming friends had been murdered and his mother had been attacked. So I think that puts to bed the idea that this is just fake news, that there's nothing to see here. The delegates who went along with South Africa point out the serious nature of farm attacks, that they themselves had endured these sort of attacks as family members as well. So yeah, I don't think Trump sort of is just shooting from the hip. I get the sense that he probably knows a lot, and there's an issue that no one else has ever championed. I mean, this has been a burning issue for decades in South Africa. When anybody has ever written about it, they're dismissed as conspiracy theorists or spreading a myth of white genocide. The way to sort of not deal with farm murders is to claim, well, these guys say there's a white genocide, and obviously that's false. And no reasonable organization claims there's a white genocide in South Africa. They just say there's a serious problem with farm murders, and that's an issue worth talking about. And so the denialism and the sort of, degradation and humiliation. When you look at some of the coverage of those people who sought refuge in America, was to try and belittle them and call them cowards, including Barack Obama. And I sort of think this is exactly what Jews in the 30s endured, when they escaped and they were told, this is evidence that you aren't real Germans because you're fleeing like rats from a ship. And these are the sort of things that were said by Nazis at the time. And I imagine, some of those refugees who really, have given up everything that they know, probably not first language English speakers in a lot of cases, are taking a big risk. And then to be further vilified under situations where, some of them might very well have, survived home invasions and things like that. I mean, I'm sure both of us know, many listeners are going to know people who've taken other routes to leave South Africa. They've immigrated because they couldn't stand the high levels of crime, because, they'd suffered a home invasion. I mean, there are hundreds of thousands of South Africans, who have fled the country and live abroad. Not just white South Africans, people of all races who've said, it's intolerable and we want to live a better life. And there are others like AfriForum and Solidarity and Lex Libertas, which is now run by Ernst Ritz, who say South Africa is the only home that the Afrikaner people have. They've been here for almost 400 years and they want to stay. They want to build a life here, and it's important that that life is a tolerable life where they're not treated like second-class citizens and persecuted. I also think that Jews and Afrikaners have been walking a sort of similar path since October 7th. That the amount of vitriolic hate directed at the Jewish community in South Africa has been immense. That you have the president seeing from the river to the sea, which really is a sort of call for all Jews to be removed from Israel. If you think that the entirety of Israel, has no right to exist, that is a call for, either for genocide or for ethnic cleansing. This has been sort of parroted by, very high officials, that some of the terrible acts of violence that were performed against women and children on October 7th look quite similar to some of the things that have happened in farm attacks. The rapes, the brutality, the torture. And I think those communities sort of, in some senses, have had a mutual recognition of the threats that they face. And there have been a lot of, I think, quite positive partnerships that have happened. The first organization that I saw to publicly denounce Hamas's attacks were the Afrikaner Bond on October 8th. And so I think, those communities are able to recognize, and respect each other and sort of, act to protect each other's interests. And I think that's important.
Now, I think the utterances regarding the Afrikaners who've taken up the refugee option, which has now been expanded to minority groups in general, has actually shown partly a sign of panic and partly a sign that they must are not reading the room, that the attacks on them by various officials, including Ramaphosa himself, at NAMPO, the agricultural annual event recently held, which is the largest in the Southern Africa, they did not land. And where they did land, they came thud and they landed very badly. I think, so my sense generally is that the ANC is losing control of what narrative there is. They're losing control of it, and it's just not. It's not going well. Mark, thank you very much for those insights, because they are pivotal to the way our country is being seen, as opposed to how we would like it to be seen. And as you say, to improve things in this country, but getting government's hands off the economy would go a long way to resolving a lot of problems. And there's no doubt, crime has to be facts as a result of enormous levels of crime, and it's about dignity. It's about going up the ladder. It's about a whole lot of things. I just had a thing that came to mind. Is one of the things that I think is a problem with the way the government has dealt with farm murders is many of the commentators in the community have asked for farm murders to be treated as a priority crime. And I think a lot of people are sort of seeing that as well. Priority crime is the priority, but there are other areas of priority crimes. gangsterism, gender-based violence, etc. So it's not as if they're asking for special privilege. It's that they're asking to become categorized as such. It's a bit like asking to become categorized as a disaster zone in various circumstances. So it's basically the ANC has almost allowed the righteousness to fall away from the ANC completely on this.
Yes, I mean, I think that the people who've been concerned about farm attacks have been very pragmatic to say, look, there's a concern here. The nature of these crimes is special. It requires special kinds of policing because, farms are spread out, they're large areas. There was a commando system in place which was quite good at keeping crime at bay, and that was actively disbanded by the government. As I say, if you look at what people have wanted, they haven't been dramatic things. It's not saying stop policing all other crimes and only focus on us. It's saying that there are certain things that would make a difference to deal with this special kind of crime. And we need assistance on that. And what they've been met with is ridicule and denial. It was interesting that John Steenhuisen in the Oval Office sort of made the claim that this should be considered a priority crime. So there is a sense in which it's so sad that it's taken 30 years to get to this point. But I think for those that have been involved in raising the issue for so long, they'll be very heartened by how the meeting went. And one hopes that, as much as it was a difficult meeting, that this leads to real reforms in South Africa. And I think we must sort of see it as an opportunity for change and for having a good ongoing relationship with America instead of becoming an isolated country.
Well, having asked two final questions, I finally say thank you, and we'll see you, no doubt, fairly soon again on this podcast series. Thanks.
Absolute pleasure. Cool.